Hi, I'm Father Joel, and welcome to Pilgrim Priest. I'd like to do a quick shout out to Mark and Kathy, together with the twins and their wives and Mary Rose. I miss you guys. I hope you're doing well, and thank you so much for supporting the show. Also, dear listener, thank you for tuning in, and God bless you. I can't remember exactly what the project was that my dad was working on. I just remember that I didn't want to do it. It seemed like it was going to be long and boring and hard. And so I dragged my feet a lot, stayed in the house, finally went outside to help my dad with his project and complained a bunch. And before I knew it, the project was over. And I thought, if I had known this wasn't going to be a long, boring, and difficult project, I might have just got it over with right away. I might have approached it with a different attitude. Have you ever set out to something that you thought was going to be very difficult and then discovered that it didn't take very long? Remember, one guy in the seminary was explaining that he moved into a new room in the seminary, and there was a ring around the toilet. We all had private bathrooms. And the previous guy had said, "You'll never get that off." I tried, and it never came off. He said, "Okay." Well, after a couple weeks there flushing it, he thought, I might as well try, right? So he gets the little scrubby brush. He barely even touched the ring, and it came right off. In a lot of ways, that's a good analogy for confession, right? We think this sin will never come out. This sin will never come out. Finally, we go to confession, and we get absolved of our sins, and out it goes, right? How does life look different if we look at it from the other end? I think for many of us, life might look long and difficult, sometimes boring or challenging. But imagine for a moment what life will look like when we're on the other side, looking back. Maybe we'll have that same reaction I did with my father's project, thinking, man, I could have done a little bit more. I could have loved a little more generously. I could have forgiven a little more freely. I could have worked a little bit harder at the things that matter. Sometimes I wonder what we'll think when we get to heaven. And I don't want to have regrets on that side. I want to be able to look back on my life and say, I left it all on the court. I did everything that I could. I used the gifts that God gave me to the utmost to bless God and to bless my neighbors. I don't want to think, man, I held back because I thought it was going to be hard, difficult, long, impossible. You'll never get that ring off the toilet bowl, only to discover that at the other end, I realize I could have done more. Ash Wednesday starts. I won't surprise you that it's on a Wednesday this year. And as we look at Ash Wednesday, we often think, well, what am I going to give up for Lent? That's kind of the tradition that we have. But I think it's worth looking at and asking yourself, how does my life look different when I'm on the other side? Remember the traditional blessing of Lent. Remember you are dust, and to dust you will return, right? It's a call back to the Garden of Eden, back to right after Adam and Eve sin and death enters the world. They're reminded, remember you are dust, and to dust you will return. It's a solemn and stark reminder that none of us is going to live forever. That each of us, sooner or later, is going to experience the end of our life. And at that moment, the Lord will ask an accounting for us of what we have done with the gifts that He's given us. And we'd like to hear the Lord say, "Well done, good and faithful servant," and not something like, "You lazy bum." So when we look at our life from the end, now we look at today and we look at our Lenten season, we realize we've been given a great gift because there's another opportunity to repent, another opportunity to do good, another opportunity to step up in and live a life more of self-giving love. That's really fundamentally what Lent is about. In my mind, we should start our Lent by thinking of the end and our eternal destiny and ask ourselves, when I look at my life from that perspective, am I really living this moment well? But I would also invite you to think back to Christmas. And I know Christmas might feel like a long time ago, but Christmas, I think, is meant to be a moment when we encounter God's love incarnate for us. When was the last time you really felt close to God? When was the last time you knew you were on the right track? You experienced God's love for you. Now, for some people, it may have been a long, long time ago. It may not have been at Christmas that you experienced God's love. For other people, it may have been quite close. It may have been a quite recent experience of prayer or confession, a quite recent experience of Holy Mass, or driving and feeling God's love reach you. There may be a recent time when you felt God's love. But it's worth looking back at that moment when you experienced God most recently or in a most profound way, and saying, how does my life look different when it's lived with God? How does my life look different when it's lived for God? Our faith teaches us that this is not the end, this is just the beginning, but our eternity will in many ways be determined by the decisions that we make here and now, how we live our life today. So St. Paul looks forward to the resurrection, and it was difficult for him to preach this good news to the Greeks, because Greeks were convinced that human beings were just spirits, and those spirits had somehow become trapped in this stinky tired body of meat, and they were looking forward to the body passing away and the spirit finally being free of the chains of mortality. But that's not how St. Paul viewed humans. He saw humans as a unity of body and soul, as the body and soul as a team working together. And the everyday ordinariness of this life, far from being the things that drag us down, were opportunities for us to love God and love our neighbor in concrete ways. Just like it says in our first reading, when the sieve is shaken, the husks appear. So is a man. When a man speaks, you see what his character is. My grandfather once commented, he said, it's better to stay silent and let people think you a fool than open your mouth and prove them right. He may have been hoping that I would stop talking. I wanted to respond to my grandfather, but it's really hard to respond to that, isn't it? You can't say much. But this is what our first reading reminds us, is that when you open your mouth, when you say what you're thinking, people can notice if you're not thinking very much, if you're not thinking very clearly. When we have something to say, but there's nothing there, there's no content there, right? But then it goes on to point out that these tribulations and trials are opportunities for us to be tested. And sometimes when the wrong words come out of our mouth, we discover that we've been storing up in our hearts anger or unforgiveness or resentment or contempt. And we see more clearly what's in there, and we realize I have more work to do. I need to be storing up goodness so that when things are difficult, goodness still comes out of my mouth. The second reading then reminds us that living with God and living for God, it'll all be worth it. And I think this is also something we need to remember. We can often feel like our contribution to the world is really small, that we can't really make a change in the world. So what difference is it going to make if I live a better life or a worse life? I just had a funeral on Friday for Peter Frisch. He died at 68. Peter was a very disabled He was a small person. He was never able to speak. It was his parents' dream that he'd be able to talk, but he was never able to. However, his sister, Teresa, she spoke and she shared that she became a social worker because of having a disabled brother, and that she could see the effect he'd had on everybody around him. And she said, you might have thought he lived a very small life. Most of his time was spent in CBRFs in the community, he said. But if you could notice the impact he'd had, you'd realize he lived a very big life, that he had had a positive impact on the people that knew him. And that gives us pause. It's impossible for us to know what our kind words, our acts of sacrifice, our generosity, the ways that we unite our sufferings to Jesus' suffering on the cross, the mercy and forgiveness we offer those who don't deserve it, the good works that we do when nobody's looking. It's impossible for us to know the impact that those are going to have in the long run. But when we look at it from the perspective of eternity, we can say that it was all worth it. How does your life look different when you remember you are dust, and to dust you will return? A little boy goes to his deacon, asks a question about God. The deacon doesn't know, so he says, well, we'll ask Father. So they go to Father and they ask the little boy's question. The priest doesn't know either. And the little boy's pretty discouraged, and the deacon, and they say, well, that's okay. We'll call the bishop. The bishop's very wise. He'll have an answer. So they get an appointment for the bishop. The little boy goes to see the bishop. He asks his question. The bishop doesn't know either. The little boy's leaving the office very sad, and the bishop's, and as he's walking out, he runs into a nun. And the sister says, what's the matter, little boy? And he says, well, nobody can answer my question. She says, what's that? And he asks the question, and she has an immediate answer. And he's so happy, but he says to the bishop's secretary, how come the deacon didn't know, the priest didn't know, the bishop, he's supposed to be very wise, and he didn't know? And the bishop's secretary says, well, that's because she's none the wiser.